In the quiet suburban maze of Pine Ridge Estates, life was polished and predictable. Manicured lawns, pastel-painted mailboxes, and neighbors who smiled but never truly spoke beyond the fence line. It was the kind of neighborhood that advertised itself as perfect. And like most perfect places, its perfection came at a cost. The Homeowners Association. For most residents, the HOA was just part of the landscape, the unseen hand that issued monthly reminders, sent warning letters, and posted smiling community updates on the bulletin board by the gate. But for one homeowner, that invisible hand was about to become a clenched fist. Her name was Lena Hartley, a 42-year-old teacher, quiet and pragmatic, who had lived in Pine Ridge for nearly a decade. She loved her small house, its shaded porch, and her rose bushes that lined the front path. But after a car accident left her partially disabled, everything about her home, her safe place, suddenly became an obstacle. When Lena returned home after weeks of physical therapy, she realized she couldn't enter her house without help. The front steps were steep, and the pain in her legs made climbing them unbearable. Her doctor recommended a wheelchair ramp, a simple, functional modification. She thought it would be easy. With help from a neighbor's son, she had a small wooden ramp built, extending neatly from the porch to the walkway. It wasn't fancy, just sturdy, safe, and designed to give her independence again. For the first time in weeks, Lena rolled through her own front door without assistance. She cried not from pain, but from relief. That peace lasted exactly for days. On the fifth morning, a white envelope appeared on her door. The HOA letterhead glared from the top like a warning. Inside was a citation, a violation notice, and a fine. Unauthorized modification to exterior structure. It read, non-compliant with community aesthetics. Fine, $200 per day until removal. Lena read it twice, then a third time. She thought it had to be a mistake. How could a ramp, a necessity for access, be considered a violation? She had seen neighbors install porch swings, new mailboxes, even decorative fountains without issue. But this, something she needed to move, to live, was forbidden. Her first instinct was disbelief, then anger. But more than anything, she felt humiliation. The following week, more letters arrived, each one more threatening than the last. The fines accumulated now in the thousands. Failure to comply, they said. Lean action possible, and still she couldn't climb her own steps without it. When she called the HOA office, the response was cold and procedural. The ramp, they said, did not align with community standards. If she wanted to keep it, she'd need approval from the Architectural Review Committee, a process that could take months, months she didn't have. Neighbors began to whisper. Some expressed sympathy in hushed tones, others avoided her entirely, afraid to get involved. The HOA had ruled Pine Ridge for years with quiet intimidation, a handful of board members who enforced rules selectively, protecting their friends while targeting those who questioned authority. And now Lena had become their target. But what they didn't realize was that their cruelty had awakened something powerful. Not anger alone, but resolve. In the following weeks, Lena began researching everything she could about HOA law, ADA rights, and homeowner protections. She discovered that what they were doing wasn't just unfair, it was illegal. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, accessibility modifications couldn't be denied without legitimate safety concerns. The HOA's claim of aesthetic disruption was meaningless compared to her civil right to access her home. But even knowing that, she didn't rush to sue. She was patient. She wanted more than compensation. She wanted change. So instead of writing angry letters, she began quietly talking to other residents. She learned their stories: the elderly man fined for keeping a bird feeder, the young couple cited for having non-conforming shutters, the veteran warned for leaving his truck in the driveway overnight. Every household had a story, and every story carried the same theme: fear. The HOA had built its empire on fear. And Lena Hartley was done being afraid. She began gathering documents, meeting minutes, voting records, financial statements. What she found was disturbing. The board had been operating unchecked for years, issuing fines without due process, rejecting appeals without hearings, and inflating maintenance fees while cutting community services. She shared the evidence quietly with neighbors, printing copies, slipping them under doors, leaving them in mailboxes. The response was slow at first, cautious. But whispers turned into conversations. conversations turned into meetings. In her living room, residents began to gather, tired, frustrated homeowners who had been silenced for years. They came with stories, photos, receipts, and as the evidence grew, so did their courage. Together, they discovered that most of the board's seats were held by the same 3 people for nearly a decade. Elections were announced in obscure newsletters, with ballots mailed selectively to those loyal to the board. It wasn't governance, it was control. Lena's ramp had become the spark in a much bigger fire. The night she realized that, she looked at the stack of violation letters on her desk and smiled for the first time in weeks. Not out of joy, but clarity. The same system that had tried to break her would soon answer to her. She didn't want revenge. She wanted justice for herself and for everyone who'd been too afraid to fight back. Her plan was simple but daring. She wouldn't just file a complaint or a lawsuit. She would take over the very system that had punished her. It started with one word: recall. The process was long and technical, requiring signatures, petitions, and public notice. But she knew how to organize. Years of teaching had taught her the value of persistence and patience. She started building her campaign the same way she had built her ramp, one step at a time. Soon signs began appearing quietly around Pine Ridge. Not flashy, it's not loud, just white posters with black letters that read, "It's time for change, recall the board." The message spread faster than anyone expected. Within days, the HOA office was flooded with calls. The board tried to dismiss the movement as misinformation, but the evidence spoke for itself. Lena had collected the signatures. The recall was official. For the first time in years, Pine Ridge would hold an open election. The board panicked. Letters were sent warning of disruption to community harmony. Fines were increased, meetings postponed, threats whispered. But the people had tasted freedom, and fear no longer worked. When the date of the recall meeting was announced, Lena knew there was no turning back. The same ramp they had fined her for now carried neighbors into her home for strategy sessions. What had once been her symbol of shame had become her platform for power. The night before the meeting, she stood at her window, looking out at the path leading to her porch. The wooden ramp glowed faintly under the porch light, wet from rain but solid as ever. They had tried to take it away. Now it stood as the foundation of her revolution. Tomorrow, she would face them not as a victim, but as a candidate. And by the end of that day, the HOA tyrants who had ruled Pine Ridge would begin to fall. The morning of the recall meeting dawned sharp and gray, the kind of sky that felt suspended between tension and relief. For weeks, Pine Ridge Estates had hummed with quiet unrest, like an orchestra tuning before the first explosive note. Today, the silence would break. Lena Hartley sat in her wheelchair by the living room window, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. Across the street, cars were already beginning to line up near the clubhouse, neighbors she'd known for years. Some who had never spoken more than a hello, now arriving with purpose. Flyers rustled in their hands, the recall notice printed in bold black letters. She felt no excitement, only calm, like a storm waiting for its moment to strike. The recall had taken every ounce of her patience and willpower. Weeks of knocking on doors, explaining, documenting, and pushing through layers of red tape. She had faced threats, snide remarks, and even one anonymous letter slipped under her door that read, "Drop this, or we'll make you wish you had," but intimidation no longer worked on her. Once someone has lost their peace, they have nothing left to fear. She had learned the process inside and out, the bylaws, the quorum rules, the voting requirements. The HOA board had tried to bury those details in bureaucratic language, but she unearthed every line. And what she found was their weakness. Their own system could be used against them. The recall meeting would require 51% of the homeowners to attend or submit votes. A nearly impossible turnout for most communities. But Pine Ridge wasn't most communities anymore. It was awake. By 10 a.m., the clubhouse parking lot was full. Inside, folding chairs stretched wall to wall. The room was packed with residents. Young couples with toddlers, retirees with canes, single parents juggling work schedules, all drawn together by a common grievance. At the front sat the board, President Caroline Pratt, Vice President Dennis Lowe, and Treasurer Sharon Fielding, the triumvirate that had ruled Pine Ridge for nearly a decade. They sat stiffly, their expressions composed but strained. The atmosphere was electric, not loud, not chaotic, but charged with the weight of years of suppressed frustration. When the meeting opened, Caroline's voice trembled slightly as she recited the agenda. She tried to sound confident, but every word wavered. Her authority, once unquestioned, now felt brittle. The residents' eyes weren't on her. They were on Lena. Sitting in the second row, her ramp visible through the open clubhouse doors behind her, she became the quiet center of gravity. She didn't speak yet. She didn't have to. The recall petition bore over 200 signatures. Her story had become legend, and her cause had become everyone's. The treasurer began reading out statements, claims about financial strain, necessary fines, and community aesthetics. It sounded hollow now. People shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Some shook their heads, and finally the recall motion was read aloud. Shall the current board of directors of Pine Ridge Estates be removed from their positions effective immediately? The room fell silent. For years, these same residents had nodded along with rules they didn't understand, paid fines they didn't deserve, apologized for infractions they hadn't committed. Now their hands rose. One by one, the count was undeniable. When the final tally was announced, the air seemed to crack. 78% in favor of removal, a landslide. The board was finished. Caroline's face drained of color. Dennis muttered something under his breath. Sharon sat frozen, staring at the table as if refusing to believe the numbers written before her. Lena didn't cheer. No one did. It wasn't celebration. It was liberation. The old board members left quietly, their footsteps echoing against the tile floor. The door shut behind them, leaving behind a room full of people who suddenly felt lighter, freer. Then came the next step, the election of a new board. Names were called, nominations made. People hesitated at first, unsure if they were ready to lead, but when Lena's name was mentioned, the hesitation vanished. Every head turned. It wasn't about pity. It wasn't about symbolism. It was about trust. The woman they had once watched struggle up her ramp had become the voice of reason, the embodiment of fairness. The vote wasn't even close. Lena Hartley was elected president of the Pine Ridge HOA. When the gavel passed into her hand, she felt its weight, not just of authority, but of responsibility. The same system that had punished her now belonged to her to rebuild. Her first act was symbolic but powerful. She opened the meeting minutes and declared effective immediately. All outstanding fines related to accessibility modifications are suspended pending review. A cheer rippled through the crowd, soft, hesitant, then growing louder, warmer. For the first time, the HOA meeting ended, not in frustration, but in applause. That night, when she returned home, she rolled up her ramp with quiet satisfaction. The same wooden boards that had once carried her humiliation now carried her victory. She stopped at the top, looking out across the neighborhood. The street lights glowed gently, illuminating lawns and driveways that all looked the same, but suddenly felt different, as if a hidden weight had lifted. But she knew this was only the beginning. Power always resists change, even when it's lost. The old board still had allies, people who had benefited from their favoritism, people who would fight to keep the old order alive. And deeper still, buried in the HOA's documents, Lena suspected there were more problems, unbalanced budgets, disclosed expenses, and perhaps even corruption. The recall had removed the tyrants. Now she had to rebuild the kingdom. And she intended to do it openly on camera, for everyone to see. She spent that night outlining her plan, a video series documenting every step of reform, from refunding unfair fines to rewriting the HOA's bylaws. If transparency was their weakness, it would now be her greatest weapon. As dawn crept through her blinds, she stared at the first page of her notebook. Across the top, she wrote 3 words: reform, refund, rebuild. Tomorrow, she would call the first meeting of the new board. And this time, the community would watch, not through whispers or rumors, but in the clear light of truth. The fight was far from over. But for the first time, Pine Ridge had a leader who didn't serve herself, a leader who served the people. And as the sun rose over the neat, pastel homes of the subdivision, Lena Hartley's wheelchair ramp stood like a banner of defiance, a reminder that sometimes the path to freedom begins with the very thing they tried to tear down. The next morning, Pine Ridge Estates was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet it had been before. This silence wasn't born of fear. It was the calm that follows a storm, the kind where people open their blinds and peek out, wondering if the world really has changed overnight. In a way, it had. For the first time in nearly 10 years, the HOA office wasn't ruled by the same iron trio. The glossy plaques with the names Pratt, Lowe, and Fielding had been removed from the front wall. Their empty spots left faint rectangles of cleaner paint, ghosts of the old regime. Lena arrived at the office at 9 sharp, rolling her wheelchair up the concrete path. The smell of new beginnings mixed with dust and stale air. Inside, the desks were cluttered with years of unfiled papers, broken printers, and binders labeled with cryptic notes like Enforcement 2019 and Discretionary. Funds, the fluorescent lights hummed faintly. The place felt less like an office and more like the remains of a fortress that had finally fallen. Lena wasn't alone. 2 newly elected board members were with her. Janice Ruiz, a retired accountant with a sharp eye for numbers, and Tom Bell, a young father who had been fined for parking his work van in his own driveway. Both were quiet, practical people, not power seekers, just residents who had had enough. They spent the entire morning going through paperwork, box after box of old records, receipts, and letters. The deeper they went, the uglier the truth became. There were duplicate charges to the landscaping company, consulting fees paid to businesses that didn't exist, and thousands in administrative costs with no attached explanation. Some of the largest expenses were signed off by Caroline Pratt herself. Janice's fingers trembled slightly as she flipped through another binder. They were using HOA dues like a personal credit card, she murmured. Lena didn't answer. She didn't need to. The evidence spoke loudly enough. They found hundreds of fine notices, some for trivial things, like leaves on lawn or curtain color violation. Others were heartbreaking. One elderly couple had been fined repeatedly for not painting their garage door a compliant shade of beige. They had sold their house last year to avoid foreclosure. As Lena read through the list, her chest tightened. Each name was a story. Each fine was a scar. That afternoon, she called for an emergency community meeting. No formalities, no delays. By 6 o'clock, the clubhouse was full again, neighbors seated in folding chairs, children playing quietly near the back, the air thick with cautious curiosity. When Lena took her place at the front, she didn't bring speeches or legal jargon. She brought a stack of folders. She began reading out numbers, clear, factual, and devastating. How much had been collected in fines? How little had been spent on maintenance? How many consulting payments had gone unaccounted for? Murmurs grew into gasps. People leaned forward. Some began whispering to each other, connecting the dots, realizing how deeply they'd been exploited. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Lena announced that under her leadership, the HOA would begin a comprehensive refund program reimbursing residents for fines that were unjust, unverified, or in violation of state and federal law. For years, the HOA had taken, it would give back. She explained how the first round of refunds would prioritize those most affected disabled residents, senior citizens, and homeowners who had been fined for minor infractions that never should have been issued. The room erupted in applause, not wild cheering, but the kind of slow rising clapping that comes from relief, gratitude, and disbelief blending together.
Ow.
Then Lena made another announcement. All future board meetings would be recorded and uploaded to the HOA's public website. Every vote, every discussion, every expenditure, visible to all. Transparency, she said, isn't a privilege, it's a right. The next day, she and Tom installed a small camera in the clubhouse, mounted above the whiteboard. Its little red light glowed faintly, a symbol of accountability. It was a small thing, but to the people of Pine Ridge, it meant everything. For the first time, they could see how decisions were made. They could watch their community being managed, not manipulated. And slowly, something remarkable happened. Neighbors who had once avoided each other began talking. The tension that had defined every HOA notice began to melt away. People volunteered for committees, offered to repaint the park benches, and even helped clean the clubhouse. The fear was gone. But not everyone was pleased. 2 weeks later, Lena found a letter in her mailbox, unsigned, typed, and venomous. "Don't get comfortable," it read. "You might be president now, But power changes hands fast. She read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a folder labeled threats. The old guard wasn't done. Somewhere out there, Carolyn Pratt and her allies were watching, waiting for her to stumble. But Lena was prepared for them, because this time she had the community behind her and the camera watching her front and center. The following month, the refund checks began to roll out. Families who had once struggled to pay unfair fines were now receiving envelopes with apology letters and reimbursement. The look on their faces, relief, disbelief, joy, reminded Lena why she had started this fight. The ramp that had once cost her thousands in fines had now led to thousands in refunds for others. Every story that reached her inbox, every thank you note, every smile from a neighbor who no longer feared the mailbox was proof that one act of defiance could ripple through an entire system. But power doesn't vanish, it hides. And in the shadows, the old board members were regrouping. Caroline Pratt still owned property in Pine Ridge, and as Lena's reforms spread, Caroline's bitterness grew. To her, the HOA wasn't a community, it was her creation, her control, her legacy. And she wasn't about to let someone like Lena rewrite it. When Lena rolled up to her house one evening and saw Caroline's car idling across the street, she knew it wasn't coincidence. Change had come to Pine Ridge, but war was brewing again. The tyrants had fallen. They wanted their kingdom back. For a few brief weeks, peace settled over Pine Ridge estates. It was the kind of peace that made people breathe a little deeper, wave a little more freely, and finally enjoy the homes they'd worked their whole lives for. The HOA office, once a place of dread, now buzzed with a quiet energy. Refunds processed, budgets balanced, neighbors volunteering for cleanup projects. But peace rarely lasts where power has been dethroned. The old board, Caroline Pratt, Dennis Lowe, and Sharon Fielding, had vanished from public sight, but not from influence. They still owned homes in Pine Ridge, and their network ran deep. Years of manipulation had built quiet loyalties, homeowners who had benefited from favoritism, vendors who had enjoyed lucrative contracts, and a few residents who simply preferred the old order because it was familiar. In their absence, Lena had filled the void with transparency and fairness. But fairness doesn't fill the pockets of those who once profited from control. And so, quietly, they began to fight back. It started with whispers, rumors circulated through the neighborhood's private Facebook group. Anonymous posts accused Lena of using HOA funds for personal gain. Screenshots of budget reports, cropped and twisted, appeared without context. Then came the letters, unsigned, printed, dropped in mailboxes overnight. "Your dues are being misused," they read. "Refunds mean less for maintenance. The board is unstable under her leadership." Some residents ignored them. Others started to wonder. Lena knew what was happening. Disinformation, planted by the very people she'd removed. It was psychological warfare, not with lawyers or fines, but with seeds of doubt. Still, she stayed calm. She'd learned to recognize fear disguised as anger. The louder her enemies became, the more threatened they felt. One afternoon, Tom Bell arrived at her door with a grim expression. He carried a copy of a petition vote of no confidence, demanding Lena's removal as HOA president. At the bottom were over 30 signatures. It had begun. But Lena didn't panic. She knew her power didn't lie in titles. It lay in truth. That evening, she set up her camera and began recording what would become the most important video of her presidency. The footage was simple. Just Lena in her living room, calm, steady, her voice clear. She spoke not as a politician, but as a neighbor. She explained how the refund system worked, where every dollar had gone, and how the HOA's budget was not shrinking, but finally being spent correctly. Then she showed the records, the unedited financial statements, the proof of corruption under the old board, the fake invoices and double-billed contracts. Her voice never rose. She didn't accuse, didn't insult. She simply presented facts. When she uploaded the video, she didn't expect what came next. Within hours, it spread across the community. Homeowners shared it in group chats, posted it online, and played it during neighborhood gatherings. The truth traveled faster than the lies ever could. The next morning, her inbox overflowed with messages, apologies, words of support, and new volunteers offering to help the board. The petition collapsed almost instantly. Even those who had signed it quietly withdrew. The old board wasn't finished. Days later, Lena received a notice, not from the HOA, but from a law firm. Carolyn Pratt was suing her for defamation, claiming her statements and recordings had damaged reputations. It was an act of desperation, a last attempt to weaponize the system she had once controlled. Lena didn't flinch. She gathered every file, every document, and forwarded them to her attorney. The evidence was overwhelming. Every claim she had made was backed by record. When the case reached preliminary review, the judge dismissed it almost immediately. Public accountability, he wrote, is not defamation. The dismissal was covered in the local news. A small story but symbolic. It painted a picture the entire city could understand. A disabled woman standing up to bureaucracy, refusing to be silenced by intimidation. In Pine Ridge, that story carried weight. The day after the news aired, someone left a small note taped to a ramp. "Thank you for reminding us this is our community, not their business." Lena smiled when she saw it. It was victory not yet, but it was a reminder that people had seen through the fog. Still, the fight had left scars. The HOA's reputation was fractured. Meetings were tense, whispers lingered, and the lines between old and new loyalties blurred. So Lena did what she always did when chaos threatened to consume her. She turned to structure. She called for a bylaw overhaul, a complete rewrite of the HOA's governing documents, clause by clause and public on camera. Every resident would be invited to participate. Every suggestion would be heard. Every amendment would be voted on transparently. It was an audacious idea, but it was the only way to disinfect what had festered in secret for too long. For 2 weeks straight, she and Janice worked late into the night. Drafting reforms, no fines without due process, accessibility modifications exempt from aesthetic objections, all financial records public within 30 days. Term limits for board members. Each change struck at the heart of the old power structure. Each reform erased another piece of the tyranny that had defined Pine Ridge. When the proposal was announced, it was met with overwhelming support. For the first time, the HOA meeting wasn't about punishment. It was about progress. Still, as she looked across the crowd that evening, Lena noticed something unsettling. In the back corner of the clubhouse, half hidden behind a pillar, Caroline Pratt sat silently. No notes, no allies, no control, just observation. Their eyes met once, and in that brief moment, Lena saw not anger, but something colder, calculation. The war wasn't over. Caroline wasn't fighting to win anymore. She was fighting to survive. People who are cornered are often the most dangerous of all. The morning of the bylaw vote was clear and cold, the air sharp with that particular silence, before something historic happens. In Pine Ridge Estates, everyone knew this was more than just a meeting. It was the day the neighborhood would decide what kind of place it wanted to be, a community built on fairness or a machine built on control. Lena arrived at the clubhouse early. The ramp she had fought for was slick with dew, but steady beneath her wheels. She had learned to move through resistance, physical and otherwise, one careful push at a time. Inside, the long tables were covered with folders, printouts, and a stack of freshly printed documents titled Proposed Pine Ridge HOA Reform Bylaws First Edition. Janice Ruiz had spent days auditing every clause. Tom Bell had coordinated volunteers to help neighbors who needed transportation to attend. Every chair in the clubhouse was soon filled. Even the air felt charged. For years, residents had been ruled by invisible rules, vague, weaponized language, buried deep in documents no one had read. Words like noncompliance, aesthetic harmony, and discretionary enforcement, they had meant whatever the board wanted them to mean. Today, those words would lose their power. At the front, the new board sat behind a long, folding table. In the center, calm, steady, composed, sat Lena Hartley. The meeting began at 10 o'clock sharp. Her voice carried with quiet authority, measured but firm. She reminded everyone why they were there, not for revenge, not to punish, but to rebuild trust, to make sure no one would ever again face what she had faced. The first section addressed accessibility rights. Under the new bylaws, any modification necessary for mobility or safety could not be denied, delayed, or fined, ever. The clause was clear, unambiguous, and irreversible. The second section tackled transparency. The HOA's finances would now be public record, accessible to any homeowner at any time. No more secret contracts, no more closed-door decisions. The third established due process for violations. Before any fine could be issued, the homeowner would have the right to a hearing with evidence, discussion, and community input. And finally, the fourth, the boldest of all, imposed term limits. No board member could serve more than 2 consecutive terms. Power would rotate. Leadership would evolve. It was radical for Pine Ridge, revolutionary even. Lena expected resistance, and she got it. Halfway through the meeting, Caroline Pratt stood from the back row, dressed impeccably as always. Her expression was composed, but her voice trembled with fury disguised as civility. She accused the board of rewriting tradition, of undermining the community's image, and of leading a populist takeover. Her words flowed like poison wrapped in honey, practiced, manipulative, persuasive. Some nodded, uncertain. Others shifted uneasily. For years, Caroline had been their voice of authority. Old habits die hard. Lena didn't interrupt. She let her speak. When Caroline finished, Lena quietly motioned for Janice to pull up the projector. The screen flickered, and the room filled with light page after page of bank statements, fine ledgers, and audit notes. Numbers don't lie. Each slide revealed the truth, tens of thousands of dollars in unexplained expenditures. Duplicate payments to shell companies in patterns of selective enforcement. The murmurs grew louder. Caroline's face drained of color. When the lights came back on, Lena simply said, "That's what tradition has looked like here." No one spoke for a long time. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. Then another. And another. By the time the vote was called, the outcome was inevitable. All 4 reform measures passed with overwhelming majorities. The HOA that once ruled by secrecy now belonged to the people. But Lena didn't smile. She knew the hardest part was in passing the reforms. It was surviving the backlash that would follow. That night, she sat on her porch as the sun went down, listening to the crickets sing between the houses. The neighborhood felt alive again, lights glowing in windows, laughter drifting across lawns. Yet beneath the peace, she sensed the undercurrent of something darker. Caroline had lost her empire, but she hadn't disappeared. And as history had taught Lena, power never simply fades. It hides, waiting for the right moment to return. The next morning proved her right. A letter arrived from the county office. Someone had filed a formal complaint against the HOA, alleging procedural misconduct during the recall and reform process. The complaint claimed that disabled status had been used to improperly influence governance. It was cruel, personal, calculated to wound her reputation and her cause. The complaint was anonymous, but Lena didn't need a name. She recognized the venom immediately. Caroline. Her attempt to reclaim control had shifted from the neighborhood to the legal system. But what she didn't realize was that Lena had learned to fight on that battlefield too. She spent the next week gathering every record of the recall, the petitions, the attendance sheets, the vote tallies, even the security footage from the clubhouse camera, as her evidence was airtight. When the county investigator visited, Lena presented everything neatly, labeled, time-stamped, verifiable. She didn't argue or accuse, just let the truth stand on its own legs. 3 weeks later, the investigator's report cleared the HOA completely. Not only was the recall lawful, it was praised as an exemplary exercise in homeowner democracy. The decision arrived on a Friday morning. By evening, the entire community knew. That same night, Lena hosted an open live stream from her living room, calm, simple, direct. She read the findings aloud, thanked everyone for their faith, and promised to keep leading with transparency. For the first time in Pine Ridge history, an HOA meeting went viral. The video was shared across local groups, blogs, even picked up by a regional news outlet under the headline, "HOA President Fined for Wheelchair Ramp Now Leading a Community Revolution." The story resonated far beyond Pine Ridge. Strangers wrote messages of support. Other neighborhoods reached out for advice on reforming their own HOAs. Lena had become something she never intended to be, a symbol. But symbols attract both admiration and resentment. The next week, she found her mailbox knocked over, then her garden lights smashed. A dead plant left on her porch. Harassment, petty, cowardly, but persistent. The old board's allies were still out there, trying to remind her that she wasn't untouchable. Yet as she sat by her window that night, Looking out at the street she'd fought for, she realized something profound. She didn't need to be untouchable. She just needed to be unbreakable. And she was, because what she was building wasn't just an HOA, it was a legacy. And the next chapter of that legacy was about to begin, one where the entire community would rise alongside her. By early spring, Pine Ridge had changed so much, it barely resembled the place where Lena Hartley had once been fined for existing. The lawns were greener, the neighbors kinder, the meetings open and hopeful. But beneath the surface of renewal, something ugly was still crawling through the grass. It began with vandalism, the shattered mailbox, the overturned flower pots, the scratches across the new notice board. Then came the emails, anonymous, cruel, written with precision, that could only come from someone who knew HOA procedure. You're bleeding the association dry. You're exploiting sympathy for power. Every message landed like a pebble in her calm water, making small ripples but never waves. She refused to respond. She refused to hide. Instead, she pushed forward with the Community Transparency Project, a new digital archive where every HOA document, from budgets to landscaping bids, would be uploaded publicly. Within days, residents could see where every dollar was going. The trust she had built deepened. That's when the counterstrike arrived. A place where people could just live. The camera above her porch light blinked gently, recording another quiet evening. For the first time in years, she turned it off. The war was over. But one final chapter of her story remained, the passing of the torch, the solidifying of her legacy, and the moment Pine Ridge would finally close the book on its age of tyranny. Would you like me to drop Part 5, Chapters 8 and 9? Next, the lead-up to her final election and how the neighborhood evolves under her legacy. Summer drifted gently across Pine Ridge estates. Lawns shimmered in heat haze. Sprinklers ticked in quiet rhythm. And the community that had once been divided by letters and fines now gathered beneath canopies for block parties and shared barbecues. Yet, under the calm hum of neighborhood life, an important date approached the vote that would lock Lena Hartley's reforms into the governing bylaws permanently. This was no ordinary meeting. It was the first charter ratification in the history of Pine Ridge. Every household had received a printed ballot. Every homeowner had the right to sign it publicly or privately. When the votes were tallied, the charter would become binding for decades. Lena spent the morning in her kitchen, reviewing one last set of figures. She had promised herself this would be her final act as president. Her name would remain only as a signature at the bottom of a document that belonged to everyone. By 6 p.m., the clubhouse was alive again. Long rows of tables bore copies of the new charter, neat paragraphs outlining fairness, transparency, and protection for residents with disabilities. Children played in the hallway while their parents filed in to cast votes. The air carried none of the fear that used to accompany HOA meetings. It smelled of paper, coffee, and quiet optimism. When the count began, no one breathed. Volunteers moved among the chairs, collecting slips, stacking them in clear boxes. On an hour, all that could be heard was the soft shuffle of ballots and the hum of the ceiling fans. Then Janice Ruiz, calm and steady as always, stood to announce the result. 91% in favor. A sound like relief swept through the room, hands clapping, chairs scraping, laughter breaking free. For the first time in the neighborhood's history, the governing law had not been written behind closed doors. It had been written by the people themselves. Lena didn't stand or speak. She simply closed her eyes for a moment and let the applause roll through her like a warm tide. Everything she had endured, the fines, the threats, the lawsuits, had led to this single, luminous instant of justice fulfilled.
Ow.
Later that night, after the clubhouse emptied, she stayed behind alone. The overhead lights flickered softly, illuminating stacks of papers now signed and sealed. She rolled her chair to the podium and placed the gavel down gently. Its echo lingered across the empty room like the last heartbeat of an old era. Outside, crickets chirped in the humid dark. The houses around her glowed with domestic peace, families cooking, children laughing, porch lights steady. It was the sound of a neighborhood finally exhaling. Still, she knew what power could do to people. The structures she built would need caretakers who believed in fairness, not fame. So she began quietly mentoring a younger resident, Aisha Green, a social worker and new homeowner whose sharp mind and calm empathy reminded Lena of herself years ago. They spent long afternoons on Lena's porch, going over budgets, ethics, and the importance of listening more than commanding. By early autumn, Aisha was ready. Lena announced that she would not seek another term. The election would be open, transparent, and free. When nomination day arrived, Aisha's name led every ballot. No opponent challenged her. And as the neighborhood gathered once again, Lena watched the gavel pass smoothly from her hand to another's. The crowd cheered not for change, but for continuity of conscience. Pine Ridge Estates finally had what every community deserves: leadership that served, not ruled. Seasons rolled forward, soft and certain. Under Aisha's leadership, the HOA became almost invisible the way good governance should be. Dues were stable, finances balanced, and meetings short enough to end before sunset. The bylaws Lena had written stood like quiet pillars, guiding every decision. The ramp that once symbolized defiance now appeared in brochures as an emblem of inclusion. New homeowners moved in knowing the story.
Hey!
Children asked their parents, "Is that the ramp that changed everything?" And parents nodded, proud that they lived in the place where fairness began with wood and courage. Lena stayed in her home, but withdrew from administration. She tended her roses again, read novels in the morning light, and kept a single folder labeled Community Archives beside her desk. Inside were copies of every reform, every receipt, every newspaper clipping. History preserved. Occasionally she would attend meetings just to listen, sitting quietly at the back while younger voices debated garden policies or playground budgets. Each time she felt that subtle swell of satisfaction that comes from seeing something you built live on without you. Then one afternoon, a white van pulled into the neighborhood painted with the logo of a local news station. They had come to film a follow-up piece. 5 years after the ramp, the neighborhood that changed HOA culture. The crew interviewed residents along the sidewalks. They spoke of fairness, of empathy, of never again fearing letters in the mailbox. Aisha explained how every new rule now required community consultation. Children biked past, waving at the cameras. When they reached Lena's porch, she declined to appear on camera. "The story isn't about me," she said gently. But the reporter insisted on filming the ramp itself, its weathered boards, now polished and solid. They captured it glowing in the evening light, the symbol that had outlasted the war. The segment aired across the state. Messages poured in from other communities seeking guidance, inspiration, and sometimes courage. Lena replied to a few, always ending with the same line: "Start small, stay kind, and keep the receipts." That winter, Pine Ridge held its first community day. No fines, no agendas, just a celebration. Food trucks lined the street, music played, and children painted murals on the clubhouse wall. In the center of the mural, someone painted a ramp leading up to a door, surrounded by flowers and sunlight. Beneath it, in bright blue letters, they wrote, "Access is freedom." When Lena saw it, her eyes filled, but not from sadness. It was the kind of quiet joy that only comes when justice has finished its work. She knew the neighborhood would face new problems in the future. Every community does. But now it had the tools, the memory, and the heart to face them without cruelty. As spring approached once more, she decided to record one final video. Not as president, not even as activist, but as neighbor. In it, she told the story from the beginning: the accident, the ramp, the fine, the recall, the reforms. She spoke slowly, her tone steady, like a teacher closing a long lesson. The video ended with her turning the camera toward her front yard, where the roses were in bloom again. Spring returned to Pine Ridge Estates with soft rain and the slow unfolding of roses along the front walks. The neighborhood that had once been ruled by threats now hummed with easy routine, sprinklers hissing at dawn, laughter spilling from porches, the low murmur of contentment that follows years of unrest. Lena Hartley woke early that April morning, the light pale and clean through her curtains. She brewed her tea, then wheeled to the window that faced her garden. Dew clung to the edges of the ramp's wooden rails. The boards had weathered to silver, but they remained firm beneath the polish of time and memory. She had always meant to replace them, yet she never did. They had earned their scars. It had been nearly a year since she stepped down from the presidency. Aisha Green led now with quiet competence, and the board functioned so smoothly that most residents barely noticed it. That, Lena often thought, was the truest sign of success, a government that didn't need to be feared or adored. Her days were simple again: morning tea, letters from strangers who had seen her story online, occasional visits from neighbors bringing bread or flowers. The ramp that once marked Defiance had become a pilgrimage spot of sorts. Families paused by it on walks. Parents told their children the tale of the teacher who taught the board a lesson. Sometimes she heard the story retold in warped by time windows, warped by time but still warm with admiration. She never corrected the details. Legends, she knew, belonged to the listeners. That afternoon she rolled down the ramp to prune her rose bushes. The air smelled of wet soil and faint cedar. As she clipped away the dry stems, she noticed one bloom at the base of the railing, a single red rose growing out of a crack between the boards. She couldn't recall planting it there. Perhaps a seed had drifted on the wind. Perhaps a bird had dropped it. Either way, it had rooted itself in the scar of the structure that once carried her rebellion. She stared at it for a long time. The ramp, the rose, Defiance and Grace sharing the same space. Inside, her phone buzzed, a notification from the HOA forum. Aisha had posted a community update announcing a small scholarship fund in Lena's name. The Hartley grant for accessible housing improvements would help residents across the county retrofit entrances, bathrooms, and walkways. The fund was modest but symbolic, a continuation of what Lena had begun. She smiled, closed the message, and returned to the garden. The rain started again, light at first, then steadier, soaking the ramp until it gleamed. She stayed there under her umbrella, watching the water trace thin silver lines along the wood. As dusk fell, porch lights flickered on across the neighborhood. The camera she once used for live streams now sat idle on a shelf, dusty but still aimed at the ramp. Out of habit, she switched it on one last time and let it record the evening, the rain softening to mist, the rose shining darkly against the grain. No speech, no audience, just the image of endurance. In the months that followed, the video quietly circulated online. People who found it thought it was art, a still shot of a ramp in rain, labeled simply, "Access is freedom." They didn't know the woman behind the camera, or the neighborhood she had transformed. They only saw the symbol, and that was enough. Years later, when Lena's house was sold to a young couple, they kept the ramp rather than replacing it. They sanded the wood, resealed it, and left a small brass plaque at the top step, in honor of Lena Hartley, who opened the door. Neighbors still walked past every morning, pausing to brush dew from the rail, to lay a flower, to whisper a quiet thanks. The bylaws, she wrote, continued to guide the community. Printed in plain language on the HOA website, signed by every new president who took the oath. And so the story of Pine Ridge Estates ended not with noise, but with permanence. A ramp arose. And the quiet certainty that fairness once rooted does not die. The tyrants had long since vanished, their legacy erased by sunlight and time. What remained was what mattered, a community that had learned how to breathe, and one woman's simple proof that dignity could be built plank by plank. As the seasons turned again, the ramp stood silent under the oak trees. Carrying only rain and petals, still strong after every storm,